Good morning, and thank you, and thank you, Magda, for such an enlightening presentation. I want to thank the Women's College Hospital because they have really been at the forefront on turning a hospital in a place that gives you information on preventing disease, not just causing it. And I would like a little help to bring up my slides here, if you don't mind. Thank you. I think I got it right there. Right. So I'm going to talk with you today as an update on cell phone toxicology, exposure assessment, and epidemiology, and what we know, particularly focusing on reproduction. And my colleague, Anthony Miller, will follow me, and it's quite an honor for us to have both him and Magda with us today, as he has been at the forefront of trying to help women's health, breast cancer, and other issues throughout his very distinguished career. And he's now Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto. You've heard from Magda, I think, a very simple presentation of what the symptoms are like. I'd like to ask, how many of you have treated or know of someone personally who has symptoms of environmental sensitivity in this room? All right. How many of you have ever tried to measure EMF in your homes? Right. So this is already a very sophisticated audience. I want to just let you know that I'm privileged to work with a number of people from around the world today at some major national institutes. Note that most of them are outside of North America, unfortunately. And what we have to face is the reality that we are now living in a sea of radio frequency radiation. Magda showed you the incredible growth in Wi-Fi. I would say the world today has more cell phones than toilets. And that's an interesting commentary on the growth of this industry. When it comes to understanding the electromagnetic spectrum, it's important to realize that it extends all the way from those things that are radio waves and those things that allow us to hear radio and television, all the way up to gamma and X-rays, which we know are quite toxic. The important thing to realize is that the microwave spectrum, which industry calls radio frequency energy, is in fact not at all energy. It's radiation, and it is microwave radiation. In my book, Disconnect, I explain the very term microwave radiation was invented because the first radar ranges didn't sell very well. The radar ranges were the earliest ovens, and they were designed by men to cook food who thought it would be really cool to use radar to cook food, which it is and was. But women didn't like the idea of radar ranges, so they changed the name to microwave. It sounded a little more feminine, they thought, a little more marketable. But don't mistake it. A microwave oven, a cordless phone, a cell phone, and a baby monitor all are using the same frequency. And the important thing is that while a microwave oven uses a continuous frequency, what you heard from the smart meter and the cell phone is that those devices use a pulsed frequency. And we believe it is the pulsed nature of the signal that is most problematic. And this slide here shows you an illustration from Lucas Margaritis at the University of Athens of what that pulse signal might look like. The problem is, even in this room, we're exposed to this sea of radio frequency radiation that we cannot see. And it varies by the frequency. So the microwave oven, the cell phone, the baby monitor use the same frequency, but they differ by the power, because the microwave oven uses between 750 to 1,000 watts of power, and a cell phone uses less than 1 on average. But it's the pulse nature of the signal that might be more biologically problematic. And that's what we have to pay attention to. In fact, if you look at the variation in power density, which is volts per meter, in a 4-second phone call, you see here this tremendous change in volts per meter over a 4-second phone call. The worst time to put a phone next to your head is when you first answer it. It's programmed to go to max power. Another really bad time to keep a phone next to your head is when you're driving in a car that does not have the phone going through the antenna of the car roof into the radio, because the phone is programmed to seek that signal from a tower. And every time you move from one tower zone to another, the phone will go to max power, and half of that max power gets right into you. If you have it on your head, if you have it in your pocket, it's a bad idea when you're in a car, not least of which is the problem of your reaction time while you're on a telephone at all. So there are many challenges to studying cell phone radiation, and I want to show you just a few of them. And one of them is that you have to expose animals to a level that doesn't induce heat, because in theory, cell phones don't induce heat. In fact, we know from recent research they actually do, but I won't be able to cover that right now. But they are designed, every one of the world's 6.5 billion phones is designed not to produce heat. So how do you study these things in animal? Traditionally, we use a high dose. You can't use a high dose with animals. You literally will cook them. So what we have to do is come up with a way to simulate exposure. Now, it's always been very difficult to get rats and mice to make cell phone calls. And we are basically having to expose the whole animal. And when we do that, we get into problems of exposure that we have to take into account. So effectively, we are conducting an experiment right now with our 7 billion phones in the world. Many countries, like the US and Australia, now have more phones and certainly more digital devices than they have people. Toxicology, the experimental studies that we do in animals and cell cultures, has been very useful, and I believe, as does the International Agency for Research on Cancer, that the toxicology evidence here is quite compelling, because it shows that radiofrequency radiation affects cell structure and cell function. And I'm going to go back to that as I go through some of the data now developed in rabbits, insects, and even in the lonely C. elegans, a very nice symmetrical nervous system we get to study. We can study these things with in vitro and clinical evidence, and I'm going to review some of that. But as Magda just showed you, there's a wide array of biological impacts of radiofrequency radiation. And this drawing from Haddad in 2009 nicely indicates to you that we have central nervous system effects, we have effects on heart rate and blood pressure, and we have effects on sperm that have not been widely discussed in public. For obvious reasons, we're a little squeamish about discussing these issues, but in fact, today, more than 1 in 5 couples that's trying to produce a healthy baby is unable to do so, and that rate is growing. And I report in my book that a number of young men who had such difficulty were able to become fathers when they just took their phones out of their pockets. And I'm going to tell you some of the reasons why. But before I do that, I want to tell you it's really important to understand, as you will hear often from industry, but the bulk of the literature shows nothing. Well, if you just take a mathematical approach and average things, you will find that is the case. But if you start to look, as Henry Lai and others have done, at who is paying for the research, you'll find that sponsorship of research often dictates the outcomes. And many of the studies that purport to be a study of cell phone radiation are not. They'll use a continuous signal, and they'll claim that they've modeled a cell phone. A cell phone is not a continuous signal, as I showed you in that diagram. It goes up and down and up and down. Think of it like this. If you're riding in a bus or an airplane, you can read so long as the bus or the plane is moving steadily. It's resonating. But if it suddenly stops and turns, you lose your place. That's what cell phone radiation is doing. It is altering the normal resonance of every cell in the body. Now, I want to show you what I think is some of the most compelling evidence that practitioners need to be aware of in terms of reproductive effects of cell phone radiation. These are studies that have been done in several different major research centers around the world, starting with the Cleveland Clinic in the United States, Australian National Center for Research on Male Health, and major centers of research in Turkey and Greece. And they have all taken sperm from healthy men. One test tube of sperm is exposed to cell phone radiation, the other is not. The results are quite dramatic. This is a study of sperm motility as well as morphology. And in the top, you see here that the control sperm, which simply are allowed to live in a test tube with no exposure, will have much more vitality and motility, indicated here, than the exposed. They're 3 times more active, more vital, by the measures that are standardized in studies of spermatogenesis. Yes? Yes, I do. It's Aitken, it's up at the top, Deulius et al., 2009, right? And all of these and detailed references and links will be provided on the website afterwards for this conference, as well as at my website, Environmental Health Trust. If you look at the bottom slide, this is a measure of mitochondrial DNA damage on sperm. Now, a man needs to make 500 million sperm to make one healthy baby. It really is a contest of the survival of the fittest. And what this is showing is that the mitochondria of the sperm, which of course is the engine of the cell, dies 3 times faster if the sperm are exposed to cell phone radiation. The energy needed by the sperm would be equivalent to if a sperm had to swim as a human from Los Angeles to Catalina Island. It's really quite an amazing feat. And what we're seeing here is evidence, and this is a summary of studies that have been replicated in many different institutions. This is a measure done by the Aitken Group in 2009 from Australia, showing that as the SAR, which is the specific absorption rate of the phone, increases, the sperm drop in vitality. Now, SAR ultimately becomes a measure of heat. It is, in the United States, set at 1.6 watts per kilogram, averaged over a 1 gram volume. In many European countries, it's 2 watts per kilogram, averaged over a 10 gram volume, and we'll perhaps discuss that later. But the bottom line is, as the SAR increases, you do get heat. So here you see heat, and here you see, of course, dying sperm. But here is a level at which all cell phone radiation is set today. The phones in your pockets, in your children's pockets, all fall in this range right now, and this is the range which, if allowed to be left in a little boy's pocket, will actually damage sperm. This is a study from the Cleveland Clinic where Ashok Agarwal, the director of that infertility clinic, noticed that the guys coming in for fertility advice who had the most devices on their hips had the biggest problems with sperm. So he did a cross-sectional analysis, and sure enough, he found that those who reported using the phones the most in their pockets, on their bodies, had the lowest sperm count. Now, it's cross-sectional, so there could be many other factors. We know that alcohol, we know that heat, all these things affect sperm. But certainly this is a pretty compelling and interesting observation, and it's led my colleague, Professor Stanton Glantz, professor of biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco, to conclude in the 7th edition of Biostatistics in Medicine that cell phone radiation is a probable damaging cause for sperm problems. Now, this is a study done that controlled for the fact that laptops do create heat. And by the way, they're no longer called laptops. They're often called tablets because they belong on tables. They are tested. Every laptop you're using is tested at 20 centimeters from the body. I want you to think about something. Your government is spending millions of dollars now to provide iPads to children. These children are going to be sitting on the floor with iPads on their small bodies right over their gonads that are developing. A little girl, of course, has all the gonads she's ever going to have. Little boys will make them over and over again. These devices are tested 20 centimeters from an adult male body. They are never supposed to be used directly on the body, despite all the commercials showing how cool it is, even with a pregnant abdomen. This is a study that makes it clear why that's a bad idea. And this is a study done by Avedano in 2012, and again reported in a fertility journal, showing that laptop exposure controlled for heat, so there was no heat generated, that you had a quadruple increase in DNA damage in those who held the laptop on their lap. Now, DeJulius et al., the first article that I showed you, reached these conclusions in 2009. Radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation can damage sperm, maybe by causing leaks in the mitochondria or oxidative stress, all of which we know are quite damaging. There are a number of important health policy and management issues for you with your patients now because of this. They recommended then, and Environmental Health Trust recommends now, that men of reproductive age do not keep their phones in their pockets. And I will tell you that that's what the phones recommend as well. Thanks to Terrence Young, I hope you will soon have the right to know that information. Mr. Young is proposing soon a members' bill that will require that this information that has been known to the phone companies for quite some time be made public. And I really salute you for your efforts to do that. It's a great thing for all of us that you're willing to champion this. Thank you. When it comes to the question of theory and mechanism, which we are always asked scientifically, you don't have the luxury as clinicians to tell somebody, come back in 5 years when I've completed my study and I'll tell you what to do. I've often thought, that's the challenge of clinical medicine. But we do have some good theories about what's going on, and here's one that was published by the group that worked with Asha Kagawal at the Cleveland Clinic. They've noted that radiofrequency radiation can have an effect on DNA structure, causing damage to the structure of DNA through reactive oxygen species, leading to a lack of DNA repair and damage to DNA, or you can have no damage to DNA. You may have an epigenetic phenomenon where you get heat shock proteins and other enzymes produced that mean that when DNA is damaged, it is unable to repair itself. And either way, through damage to the structure or the function, the bottom line is that cell phone radiation, microwave radiation from cell phones and other devices can damage DNA. And the mechanisms by which it works in sperm certainly would be applying to other organisms as well. I want to briefly now turn to some of the new literature on effects of prenatal exposure to electromagnetic fields on the development of critical parts of the brain, the cerebellum and the hippocampus, which are, as you know, are critical to memory and balance and thinking. And this is a study that we discussed in Istanbul when Environmental Health Trust convened a major international conference on this topic. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to work with the dean at University of Toronto, Professor Miller, and others to update this conference, perhaps the next year or so, working with some of you here in this room. The study looked at the question of prenatal exposure to a 900 megahertz electromagnetic field from a normal cell phone that was set to give a standard computer-generated signal that replicated that of a phone with that erratic signal that you heard before. And this study looked at the dentate gyrus, looking at where cells formed in the brain and how they formed. Now, you don't need to be a pathologist to look at the fact that there was clearly an effect on neural stem cells. And neural stem cells are quite important in subsequent development of the brain. The bottom line is, you can see here the healthy round cells, nice packed and organized as they should be. And as we magnify further, you see the damage on the newborn rats that were prenatally exposed to cell phone radiation. They had not only damaged cells with less integrity of the membranes, they had fewer cells. So prenatal exposure to cell phone radiation causes rats to produce offspring with smaller brains and more brain damage. Now, this study is not the only study of its kind. You're going to hear after lunch from Professor Hugh Taylor at Yale University, who has similar findings in mice where he looked at behavior as well as their brains. This is effect showing in the rat hippocampus a loss of cells. Now, we all want to have as many brain cells as possible. And when you start life off with fewer brain cells, you're really handicapped from the get-go. Prenatal exposure to wireless transmitting devices doesn't just damage the brain of the rat, it also damages its ability to respond and learn and causes damage to the testis, not surprising. The testicular barrier, so-called, is actually 100 times more sensitive than any other part of the human body. It will absorb chemicals. It will also absorb radiation. And here's a series of studies that I summarized from Ordu Medical University in Turkey on behavior. Now, animal behavior tests, as many of you know, are standardized. This is something called a radial arm maze. And the radial arm maze looks at the ability of animals to learn how to find their way to food. It's a standardized test. In this standardized test, the control group learned the task, in less than 20 minutes, and with not that many errors, maybe 2 to 3. The EMF exposed group had 3 times more mistakes and took 3 times longer to find their way to get food. Think about the implications of that. Delays in learning for prenatally exposed animals. More interestingly is that these prenatally exposed newborns had compromised spinal cords. And again, the spinal cord is controlling the messages that get throughout the body. And you see atrophy as well as vacuolization in the exposed animals. This is a healthy, this is the unhealthy. Look, it's practically missing half the nucleus. And there are marginal irregularities and boundaries here as well. This is an example of what goes on in the testes of these animals. So there's damage to the spinal cord, there's damage to behavior, there's damage to the brain, and there's damage to the testis. The prenatally exposed rat pups show immature germ cells spilling into the testicular lumen here. And basically the cells lose the epithelium is separated, and they lose the ability to have integrity, and they will be dying. And their ability then to make healthy sperm will be impaired without any question. Unexposed control testes have distinct borders. The exposed ones have overlapping borders. And this is a 400 magnification done by Hansi and others. Now, these are rather detailed slides, but I think it's really important to understand that we've got compelling information on rats, on rabbits, on mice, showing damage from prenatal exposure. What are we doing to ourselves? Those wonderful ads for Parteribon showing pregnant abdomens happily lying down with an iPad right over the pregnant abdomen. It really is something that needs to be addressed seriously. The public has a right to know about these studies. Otherwise, they're treating their babies as though they're experimental subjects without any controls. Now, we actually have had some studies in humans, and I'm going to just show you one on the brain. This was done by Dr. Nora Volkoff, who is the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the United States government, National Institutes of Health. She published this in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and she showed that spending 50 minutes with a cell phone right here resulted in significant increase in glucose metabolism in the brain. Now, that diabetes epidemic we've heard about is also associated with an Alzheimer's epidemic, and Alzheimer's has been called diabetes of the brain. We don't know whether the etiological significance of too much glucose in the brain, but 50 minutes of holding a phone like this can significantly increase glucose in the brain. Again, the long-term impact is what we have to be concerned about. And what we do know here is that there are a number of things that are happening with cell phone radiation. It is affecting the cell function through a variety of processes, creating free radicals, reactive oxygen species, which go around attacking wherever they can find a cell to glom onto. It also impedes melatonin metabolism, and we know that melatonin is absolutely critical for cell repair. That's why you should always sleep in the dark and unplugged. And it also alters proteomics. Cell structure can also be altered, as you saw in the slides I just showed you with the damage to the spinal cord, damage to the testis, and damage to the brain. You get effects on gap junction communication. That means that junctions between cells work to help them get repaired, and they are also impaired by these exposures, weakening membranes. Now, it's interesting that we actually have very good data showing exposures of pregnant women that are used by the US FDA to set standards for medical devices. We have good data. These models have been developed by industry, and they are used when it comes to deciding how much exposure we can allow pregnant women to get. But as I published in an article that I believe is in your packet, we don't use this virtual family model to estimate exposures to cell phones. We use an antiquated model that doesn't take into account the greater vulnerability of the pregnant woman or of the fetus. And here you see, at 7 months, there's a little more protection because, of course, the baby isn't quite to the surface. But at 9 months, you get, of course, greater exposure into the fetus, the yellow being the highest exposure in this. And, of course, we are not surprised to learn that a 5-year-old will absorb twice as much radiation as a 10-year-old, as an adult, and the bone marrow of the skull will absorb 10 times more radiation than an adult, according to studies done by industry. So what we are doing at Environmental Health Trust now is trying to complete a study where we're modeling exposure to a 1-year-old. And when I talked to my colleagues in Brazil and said, could we do this? They said, yes, but why? And I said, because people are giving devices to babies like pacifiers. And they couldn't believe it. We started this project about 2 years ago. We're close to finishing it. And I think it will be quite important because we will show, not surprisingly, that the exposure gets almost entirely through the thinner body and thinner skull of these young children. You have to keep in mind that the cell phone standards of every single one of the world's 7 billion cell phones today were set to avoid heating. What I've shown you today is a variety of effects on sperm, on pregnancy, that have nothing to do with heating. These effects were produced with cell phone signals that by definition are non-thermal. These were operating cell phone-like signals, and they can damage sperm, they can damage brain, they can damage behavior. Standards were set to avoid heating, and they have not changed since 1993. The United States today is asking for advice about whether it should change its standards. I know that C4ST and other groups have contributed to that advice, as have we at Environmental Health Trust. I want you to realize something. You're not going to believe this, but the standards were set in 1993 based on taking rats and teaching them to run a maze, like I showed you before, and putting a rectal probe in them to measure their body temperature, and finding out, if they were starving rats, how hot they had to get to stop trying to find food. That was the measure. And so they set the standards for cell phones to that temperature that caused rats that were starving to stop seeking food. These standards have not been changed in 18 years. And the technologies and the users and uses are radically different today. So we really need to understand that there are some basic concepts you have to provide. The first and foremost is that cell phones are not toys. Distance is your friend. This is a bad idea. This is a plastic baby iPhone teething rattle case. Notice it's held directly over the child's gonads. These are the fine print warnings that Terence Young is so concerned about, as am I. Look here. This is actually a chapter in my book, it was published in 2010, on fine print warnings, and that's the actual relative size. Nobody can read that. This is, in fact, what it used to say on the iPhone 4 in that little pamphlet that Mr. Young points out people threw away. It would say, keep it at least 15 millimeters away from the body. This is the BlackBerry warning. Keep it 7.8 or 20 centimeters from the pacemaker if you have one. Of course, what is your heart? It is your pacemaker. And they would say, do not carry it in your breast pocket. Well, guess what? Mandatory testing is only done with a phone held next to the head or in a holster. Phones used in the shirt or pants pocket release 4 to 8 times more radiation than those held at the head. That's really important information that you need to have to give to your patients. How to protect your family? Remember, use a speakerphone, use earpieces. Do not keep the phone on the body or in the pocket. Avoid using it when signals are weak, because that's when the phone was programmed to work harder, it will empty its battery, and half of that radiation gets right into you. Protect the abdomen, pregnant women, adolescent, and men wishing to become fathers. Many countries around the globe have taken similar actions. Your future is in your hands. This is information that we make available readily. And I will talk more when we have an opportunity about what's going on in other countries. But I think you have a great opportunity here in Canada. I really want to salute Women's College and their program to provide information and evaluation for environmental sensitivity. And I hope that we can work together to see that these and other materials that we've produced will be more broadly distributed, such as some that you'll hear from Professor Taylor about after lunch. I leave you with this thought. The world is not dangerous because of those who do harm, but because of those who look at it without doing anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Devra. Thank you. Now, while we still have Dr. Davis here, I wonder if there is anyone who has some questions. And as you think about that, I wanted to mention, when you talked about the doctors and patients coming to doctors, when I started this whole process where I became involved in this because my wife and I retired from journalism to a little sleepy town of Collingwood, Ontario, and our kids started coming home listless and lethargic and cranky, and we found out about the Wi-Fi in the school, and then we found out there was a half a dozen kids. That picture that Magda showed was one of a half a dozen children in this small school wearing Holter monitors. There were children with all sorts of problems that had come coincidental with the onset of the Wi-Fi. But most importantly, since then, we evacuated our children from the school and put them in an independent school that took out its Wi-Fi. Since then, we're learning about the long-term effects. So there's one kid with so many seizures, he has a special dog in the school. We found out about it because the kid said, hey, there's a dog in our school. And there's another kid that's got pancreatitis, which every medical doctor I've talked with through my work says they've never heard of it in a child. It's an alcoholic-related disease. This is in a grade 8 kid. So there are long-term implications of this that, if they can be picked up very, very early in your practices, could prevent a world of horror for a child. And so it's very, very critical that if you have any questions on your mind right now, if you could please come to the microphone and ask Dr. Davis. Is there anybody who can think of it at this juncture? Any more questions?
While they're thinking, I want to just add a comment. We are working with Professor Miller and others to come up with a case definition and a series of questions that should be asked at every intake with respect to breast cancer. And I think we could probably come up with Magda with a list of a number of diseases where there should be standard questions asked about not only cell phone use, but other wireless devices. And I want to just make sure you understand, distance is your friend. And even if you live in an apartment with, you pick up 12 signals from other people, if you can keep your space clean as possible and practice electromagnetic hygiene, that's a very important step to take. Just as an example, if you can't afford the shielding, which is expensive, and a lot of people can't afford these things, just move your bed away from the wall, 1 foot, and then you are protected from the dirty electricity that may be coming through it. Now, that's not a perfect solution, but the perfect solution will come about when more members are as courageous and well-informed as Mr. Young, and they understand that people have a right to a cleaner environment overall. Thank you. Right.
Thanks for your interesting presentation. I'm Rosemary Frey with the Medical Post. A couple questions. People do a lot more texting now than they do. Mm-hmm. So how does that affect all the effects you're talking about? And also, can you explain why one of the things you quoted is that phones used in shirt or pant pockets release 4 to 8 times more higher SAR than when they're held at the head?
Sure, I can. Thank you for the question. Texting is generally better than not. However, if you text, and we have studies from New Zealand and Australia, that children will keep the phone on their bodies. Even when the school says you can't have one, they'll keep it hidden in their pocket. And they're so good at this, they can text without looking. They can text without looking on these devices. And that's really a bad thing. It goes into the answer to your second question. Texting is a good idea so long as the phone is not stored directly next to the body all day long. That's the important thing. Distance is your friend. Now, why is a phone in a shirt or pants pocket giving you more exposure? Interestingly, when you hold a phone next to your head, you've got the skull. And we adults really are thick-skulled, right? We do have thicker skulls. A thicker skull, bone, does not allow radio frequency radiation in as well as fat and fluid. A microwave oven cooks things because it takes the molecules of water or fat and heats them. The brain is more protected by the skull. Your chest, particularly your breast, as you will see from Professor Miller's presentation that he's about to make, the breast has no protection whatsoever. You put some microwave radiation on the breast and it goes right through it. As a matter of fact, microwave radiation is being used now to detect breast cancer. And so we know that microwave radiation gets directly into something that's fat or fluid. Therefore, when the phone is on your chest, where there is not a skull, or in your lower pocket where it sits, as men sit on at a chair, right over their gonads, which are nothing but fat and fluid, that will get the highest exposure. In fact, the greatest exposure gets into two parts of the human body, which is the nose and the penis, which don't have any bone, really, it's just cartilage to protect it. Now, because the nose and the ear, by the way, it's cartilage, don't have a lot of blood flow, they don't tend to get cancer. But reproductive organs are vulnerable to exposure because they are not protected by skull or bone. Thank you.
You mentioned that the Alzheimer.
Sorry, Dr. Kropp, if you could just announce yourself.
Yeah.
Dr. Joseph Kropp,
I am
medical
retired
doctor.
You mentioned that the Alzheimer is the diabetes of the brain. And could you comment a little bit about it? Because I'm not particularly sure what you mean by this. And is it too much sugar in the brain, or this is not enough sugar in the brain?
Well, first of all, I must say I'm not an expert on neurodegenerative disease, but as it has been explained to me, the alteration in amyloid plaque is thought to be involved in the process. And again, we're not quite sure about which is the cause and which is the consequence. I mean, does the buildup of amyloid plaque come because of the Alzheimer's, or does it cause it? But the bottom line is that there is more glucose in the brain of those with Alzheimer's. And I don't think we know the answer to your question. I think it would be important to get an answer to that question. But the reason others have used the word diabetes of the brain is because on average, when they do the autopsy work, which is the only way we can answer this right now, the brains of those with Alzheimer's are characterized by greater levels of glucose. And of course, you have glucose, and so do I, in our brains right now because we're thinking and talking to each other. The question is not, is glucose in the brain inherently bad, but is glucose in the brain that's being made when you're not talking? Remember, these people, they didn't know whether the phone was on or not. We need glucose in our brain in order to allow us to think and to process information. But the question is, what is the consequence over the long term of having this? And I think there are so many important research questions. We will hopefully get into this later. What we need is a major international independent research program. And I think my idea for it is we say, would you give 2 cents? I want 2 cents a month for 5 years from every cell phone user, every industry, every internet provider, for every phone in the world. 2 cents a month. Over a period of 5 years would give us the money we need for training, for research, and of course for monitoring, which we're not doing now. We have no idea whether these children who have dropped dead in the schools that we've heard about have dropped dead because of Wi-Fi. But don't you think we should find out? So you've asked a good question, and I wish I had the answer.
Rodney, if I can have, another maybe question.
Yeah, we have lots of time for questions, please.
No, this is very interesting. It just happened to be that at my passing away, slowly, I think, as we all do, but I'm closer than a lot of you here. I started to study the role of the adrenals in the stress. Mm-hmm. And what I so far know about these things, and so on, is that the adrenals are the most important organs handling and protecting us from the stress. Now, one of the roles of the adrenals is to deliver the glucose, and this is the second most important nutrient after the oxygen, to the brain. Mm-hmm. So this Alzheimer really, bugs me, because when you have too much glucose, so what's the mechanism? Where is it coming from? And I assume the stressor, like electromagnetic field, there will be the same stressors as the chemicals. There will be the same stressor as the psychological stressor. Okay, yeah. And they all, at certain points, they are causing the adrenals to be stimulated, when it's going to be too much cortisol and too much glucose around and we have the symptoms of the overactive adrenals as the insulin resistance. But the adrenals, they do not continually can be overactive. Usually we know that from 2 to 4 years, they're starting to be exhausted, and then there is no sugar, or it's never no sugar, because at that time the adrenaline gets, increased, instead of the cortisol. So I'm really puzzled with these things, is that brain is having, what stage are we in the adrenals exhaustion? Because EMF is the stressor, and it's constant, and it's so. It's interesting,
It's very interesting.
And I want you to continue the research, so on. Okay, well, I only see the patients, now clients.
Well, I thank you very much for your question. Let me share with you another phenomenon that might be relevant to your question. We know that there are various mechanisms that have been shown to be involved with EMF exposure, and one of them is an effect on calcium channel. Voltage-gated calcium communication is involved. There's been a number of analyses recently done where you can block the effects of EMF with calcium channel blocking drugs, right? You can block the effects of EMF with naloxone, which, as you know, is used for people who have taken an overdose. So what do those two things tell us? Well, one, it tells you that the calcium channel may well be involved in opening, allowing more glucose. And again, as you know, we need glucose, but we need the right amount at the right time. For the naloxone effect, Nora Volkoff, after all, she started her study. She's the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. She was interested in addiction. She was interested in the question of, do cell phones, are they addictive? Well, guess what? I think it's no secret that her underlying hypothesis was that it increases dopamine. Dopamine is really critical. It's drugs, sex, rock and roll, cocaine, and maybe cell phones. Increase dopamine. It's one of the pleasure-giving parts of the brain. And if that's also involved, we know, unfortunately, this is a complex phenomenon. I mean, the brain is a marvelously interesting thing, and I'm glad that in your later years you've decided to study these questions, because we don't have the answers, and we really do need them. And I suspect it's going to be a complex interaction, just as it is for many of these things. Why, nutritionally, we know that some things, as Magda alluded, can be useful to help to repair damage. You all should sleep in the dark. If you can't sleep in the dark for some reason, use a sleep mask. And melatonin at night is really important. The importance of melatonin is made very clear by two examples of research that have been done. In Sweden, where they have much better data than we do, they've studied blind women and their rate of breast cancer. Tony, are you aware of this one? Blind women in Sweden have about half the rate of breast cancer as sighted women. And the theory, and it's pretty well established, but it is still a theory, is it's because they are constantly in high levels of melatonin, because they're in darkness all the time. And melatonin is a very good antioxidant. It repairs damage throughout the body. You really need to sleep to restore yourself. I think it's very, very important. So the other line of evidence on the importance of melatonin comes from some in vitro studies with EMF, where you can block some of the effects of EMF by exposing the cells first to melatonin. So again, it's going to be a complex story here, and we really need major investment in research. It's not that we know everything we need. We don't need any more research. We need a lot of research. But the question that I would ask is this: do we want to go through with this issue what we went through with smoking, with asbestos, with vinyl chloride? I think as a grandmother and a scientist now, we don't. We can't. We don't have definitive proof, certainly at the level that we would require it. But if we ignore this evidence, we're making a big mistake. Right now, the International Agency for Research on Cancer has declared cell phone radiation a possible human carcinogen. And Dr. Miller will tell you why he and I believe it's a probable one. Possible human carcinogen. That's the same category as lead, DDT, and engine exhaust. How many of you would give your children lead or DDT to play with in schools? And yet your government is about to give your children this possible human carcinogen to use every day in school. It makes no sense.
Hi, Rena Bray here, Women's College Hospital. We see a lot of patients with a lot of problems in this realm, and the cornerstone to our management is mindfulness-based stress reduction strategies, so that we can get the limbic system to calm down this constant stress reaction that's occurring with whether they're chemically sensitive or EMF sensitive, etc. We find that we try to empower patients so that they actually are able to calm themselves as much as they can if they can't get out of the situation fast enough. So that's helped. But I think what my point is that they are under a lot of stress. The irritability, you can't concentrate, your heart's pounding, you just have this constant, like you're on a treadmill feeling, and it really burns people out, and that's the aging process. So I think stress is a huge one, and it's the physiologic stress, but then it's the emotional stress that comes with not being able to function.
Right.
So stress is a huge issue, and the adrenals, for sure, they get fried. And so we try to get the adrenals back. Once we do all the avoidance and all the things that Magda was saying, we try to really work on getting that back on track.
Well, I really appreciate your comments, and again, I thank you for your pioneering work, Dr. Bray. It's really important. I guess, obviously, as a practitioner of yoga myself, I wouldn't survive without it. I think all of us have to recognize the importance of deliberate breathing and taking the time to try to settle ourselves. But one of the things I want to be aware of, and I know you know this because you've written about it, is that no matter how good you can be at meditating and stretching and doing the things that you can, if you're living in a dirty environment, it's really hard and it's really difficult, which is why this is not just a medical problem. This is a social problem. This is a political problem. And it's not going to be until more and more people like those of you in this room who are in a position to communicate to others, this is a serious issue. We run the risk of producing generations that will have serious difficulty reproducing, that will have impaired abilities to think. This is huge. This is not a bet any of us really wants to take, and frankly, nobody has really asked us if we want to take that bet. We have been blithely proceeding as though everything is okay, and I want you to understand that the lack of definitive scientific proof of harm, which I agree with Magda, we have some proof, but the lack of what the public regards as definitive proof of harm is not proof of safety. And we should stop this experiment and start to take steps to do some of the things that you and Magda and others have been talking about. Yeah.
Kathy Cooper with the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Your presentation title refers to epidemiology, and your presentation gave us a great outline of some specific details around, in vitro testing, both animals and humans, and some of the clinical data. But I didn't hear much about epidemiological studies, although I imagine there aren't very many, but I wonder if you could speak to that in more detail, or make reference to where we can find more information.
Okay, thank you. Professor Miller is going to discuss that in more detail, and so we decided that I would leave most of that to him, but in fact, the cancer world, which I come from as a cancer epidemiologist, is a very problematic one. As he will show you, when the bombs dropped to end the Hiroshima at the end of World War II, there was no increase in brain cancer from the ionizing radiation from the bombs until 40 years later that showed up in the general population. So it took 40 years from that known exposure to show in the population an increase in brain cancer. Ask yourselves, what environmental carcinogen causes an increase in cancer in the population in 10 years? Okay, not tobacco. Maybe ionizing radiation in children, right? We know from leukemia. Maybe some high occupational exposures. There are some. But almost no environmental carcinogen. Certainly not asbestos. It takes sometimes 40 to 60 years. So the absence of an epidemic, which we have in the epidemiology of cancer, for the most part, we have no epidemic, but that should not be taken as proof that we're fine. And the other epidemiology, I showed you some cross-sectional analyses that have been done with human males, where they've looked at sperm and reported use of cell phones in the pocket. And Dr. Miller will show you some of the cancer data. And the other data becomes very problematic because what are some of the symptoms that Magda talked about? Headache, right? Insomnia. I mean, these are serious problems. There are people who cannot function because they are unable to sleep. And I have had so many people who've told me they've had problems, and I've said, just unplug. Unplug whatever's in your bedroom and make sure you're not on the back of your neighbor's modem or router. And it really does have an effect. So what I would say to you as an epidemiologist, and this is a tough one because I don't want to come off as opposing my own science, is that epidemiology confirms the past, okay? It tells you about the past. It tells you these people who smoked, they developed cancer. These people who worked with asbestos, they developed mesothelioma. These women who took hormone replacement therapy, they developed heart attacks and breast cancer. It tells you the past. So epidemiology should not be held up here like the cross to the vampire. Wait, we don't have epidemiologic evidence. Are you kidding me? Should we really insist on proof of human harm before we take steps to protect my grandchildren? I don't think so. So that's why, for my own view, as an epidemiologist, is that we want to use the experimental evidence that we have, which I think is very compelling, and take advantage of it, take advantage of the clinical observations that Magda has made, and start to put that information into clinical practice now. Because somebody comes in to you with blinding headaches and they can't sleep. You cannot say, come back in 5 years and I'll figure it out. You've got to do the best you can. And I think right now we know enough to say you need to unplug, distance is your friend, practice electromagnetic hygiene. Thank you.
I'm Maria Schleifer, M.D. I just wanted to comment on a couple of things from the perspective of the clinician that sees these patients. First of all, I wanted to offer a little bit of hope. I've been in integrative medicine now for about 15 years, and there really needs to be more of a marriage that occurs between all the incredible information you're giving us here and how do we apply it to actually helping people that are in trouble. And some of the things that we do in integrative medicine is from a biochemical perspective that can actually measure some of these changes at an intracellular brain level. And we can then use nutrients, different vitamins, minerals, glutathione, and other things to be able to buffer some of the destructive impacts that these electromagnetic and other environmental toxins are creating on the person. So I just thought I would let people know, and I think it's important that the public not panic, but realize that avoidance is a first step, obviously, which thank you, Dr. Bray, with all the work you're doing. But the people that are even more severely impacted, there is hope. There is hope that we can bring them, once the avoidance and the mind work is done, into a better biochemical place. Dr. Kropp asked a question about the effect of glucose in the brain on Alzheimer's patients. And one of the things that we're seeing is that elevated levels of glucose sustained over very long periods of time literally form something called AGEs, or advanced glycation end products. And these are like little fires that burn the protein matrices that cover neurological cells. And it accelerates the degeneration that's seen not only in Alzheimer's, but things like remitting, relapsing MS, progressive syndromes like that. And interestingly, just one more comment and then I'll sit down and shut up.
No.
Many of these people that you refer to with the neurodegenerative disorders, we have seen, and it is now becoming more evident, that they have a thing genetically in their brain called glutathione transferase enzyme deficiency states that helps to clean the brain out from all of these insults. That's why perhaps you and I can stand in the same radiation issue and not be as affected as somebody that has MS. And by identifying this, so there are genetic type tests that we can identify in these patients. There are treatments, not just orally, but even intravenously, putting some of these nutrients in that can significantly reverse some of this. And I've seen it. I participated in it. And
may I ask you?
Yes.
So if you're using IV glutathione,
yes,
and you're reversing some of the indicators
yes,
of damage, one of the questions, and it's really a hard one, do you also, at the same time, just try to reduce their exposures?
Absolutely. That is essential. That has to happen concomitantly. Or you're like a chicken, not chicken, how is it? The cat that chases the tail around, you're just going in circles. You're not breaking the cycle. So
it's very important. That's why I think Women's College Hospital is so exciting for me.
Thank you for that.
I'm so thrilled with what you're doing. I really, really appreciate it, because I remember when we were at the 125th anniversary and we were talking about this rebirth of the institution and what an incredible institution it's been for this city for over a century. And now to be at the forefront of medicine as an intervention that really, you don't just treat the patient, you try to help change the environment in which they live. And I think that that's really what is needed now. And I really appreciate your comment.
So I'm hoping that as Dr. Bray's work progresses, that it will be married with some of what we know we can do already in the background. That's not part of the so-called traditional allopathic medical model. So thank you for the time.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have two more at the microphone, please, both of you, and then we'll take a break afterwards. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Sherry Mitchell. I work in a hospital in London. And my concern are for patients that come in to this cesspool of Wi-Fi, surgeons and nurses with cell phones in their pockets in the OR, the equipment we use, they're on electrical beds. Children are giving chemotherapy through electrical pumps. They have massive screen TVs in their rooms that are all putting off all these electrical fields, plus the exposure that the staff is getting. Most people look at you like you have two heads when you try to discuss it with them. I've talked to people about putting their cell phones in their breast pockets, that your heart is an electrical organ. So I find it hugely frustrating to try and convey this information, and I also find it really difficult that patients aren't being protected and that we're going more and more into this technology.
Well, I agree with you, and after the break, I'll share with you our Save the Girls campaign. We have to start. I think one of the things that I say to young people who come in to talk to me about some of these things is you've got to start and bite off something you can chew. You can't do everything at once. You can't get on your horse and ride off in all directions at the same time. The problem is complex. There's no question about it. But I think we have to start, and I think you've identified this is a huge problem in hospitals, and hopefully, again, Women's College Hospital is going to be a leader here for the world on this issue. It is tough. It is tough. Thank you. Okay.
Hi there, my name is Yannick Goryeb. I'm the Health Information Specialist with Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada. We're just located in London, Ontario. We're the national brain tumor organization in Canada. And you mentioned the importance of standards around intake processes, Dr. Davis, and I just wondered if you know of any neuro-oncology teams in North America or in other countries that have already adopted those processes?
Well, that's what Dr. Miller and I are going to be talking about after this meeting, because Professor Miller has for more than 3 decades worked with the World Health Organization, International Agency for Research on Cancer, and I have in the past worked with them as well. They did a study that he'll talk to you about a bit for the World Health Organization that did have a rather complex questionnaire. But in those old days, that questionnaire, by the way, defined a cell phone user as someone who made 1 call a week for 6 months. So obviously, we've got to do some rethinking about all of that. It's out of date. But we do need, as your question implies, a standardized intake instrument. It's absolutely critical. And we'd love to work with your foundation. We're working also with the Brain Tumor Foundation in the United States to see that we standardize the intake question. And I'm working with the chairman of Neuro-Oncology at UC San Diego, Santos Kesari, so that we will start also at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. There's a number of people in neuro-oncology now who want to do this. So I think if your group is interested, we can actually do something very, very functional and very important here. Because without a standardized intake questionnaire, I mean, we can't say, do you use a cell phone? Of course. We have to say, where do you keep your cell phone? How often do you use it? Do you use a headset or a speakerphone? How many hours a day or week or month we have to, do you use it? And those questions we have to start to ask on a routine basis. As Dr. Miller is going to show you in his exciting presentation, it will come shortly after our break, we've got a lot of work to do. But with the start we have here, I'm really encouraged. I was very pleased that we met yesterday with the dean, the new dean at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health, who has said that he's very interested in environmental health, expanding that work, and especially to include this topic.
I'm going to allow speaker privilege here. One more question.
Devra, could you just quickly mention insulin pumps and the effect on plasma glucose?
As we discussed last night, this is really alarming. Many people who have insulin pumps, who are type 1 diabetics, they're switching to wireless. And I want to ask if any of you have seen someone like this, because I now have 2 patients, where the wireless insulin pump is causing their glucose levels to go haywire. And no one is making the connection that the pump itself, which is constantly getting the Wi-Fi signal, is causing this abnormality in their own glucose level. So the pump, and they're really having a great deal of difficulty stabilizing. Well, hello? I mean, this is unbelievable to me. A similar problem with atrial fib. They put wireless monitors on patients before cardiac surgery, and the wireless monitor could be causing some of the abnormalities of the heart that they're then being treated for. I just find it amazing. And I've talked to some cardiologists. I don't know if Dr. Hugh Skelly is here or not, but he's one of the most informed cardiologists I've spoken to so far. And he understands this, but most people do not. And I thank you for asking that question, Magda. Hopefully we can get the word out, and I would invite, Ivana, how many of you have seen someone with a wireless insulin pump problem? Hands up? One? All right. It's a start. All right. I'll leave you with this thought. It is a complex problem, as we've talked about today. But there's a proverb from the Talmud that I think is instructive. And it goes like this. A group of workers are told to do a job. And they say, are you out of your mind? We can't finish this. It's too big. We don't have the right tools. Forget about it. And the rabbi responds, it's not up to you to finish the job, but you must begin it. And I think that's what we're doing here today. Thank you.